So I grew up everywhere, across Canada, over in Europe as well. And my father was also born in Northern Ireland, also lived in the United States and lost his brother in the Vietnam War. So these are all things that influenced, my perspective on things, having such a broad perspective, as well as having experience in a number of different provinces in Canada. I'm a bit of a nomad. Rolling stone gathers no moss. In particular, my house has no clutter as a result because I move a lot. And so, in terms of my post-secondary education, my first degree is actually in political science. I had that training, and that was from University of Ottawa and Carleton University. And then I went off. As you can appreciate, I graduated in Ontario in the early 90s. And so Ray days and, all of those cuts that were going on. So what does a girl with a political science degree do? She goes back to university. So I actually toddled off to BC, where the economy was much stronger, and did both some undergraduate training. Obviously, I had to bump up my math and stats, and then did a master's degree before moving back to Ottawa and working in the federal government for quite a while. And then after seeing policy actually made, I left and got a PhD in economics. And I've been an academic ever since.
Now, before we examine in more detail the three issues that I think will be high on a new government's agenda, fiscal, economic, and political, perhaps, Lindsay, you can give me your view on what other issues a new government will need to address.
Boy, well, today was a big news day. In the Alberta election, we have the results of the ethics probe of Danielle Smith, and the conflict of interest with regard to her possibly talking to Crown. Some very shocking comments from a candidate about transgendered students. And then today we've also had the Ukrainian Association come out and talking about comments that two UCP candidate members have made about the war in the Ukraine. So, there's a lot going on. And outside of the fiscal aspects, which I know, we really want to get into, we do actually have a fundamental challenge of values across the political spectrum. And too often, especially here, people, throw out the term wokeism and things like that without truly understanding. What we're trying to do is build an economy where everybody is valued. They can allocate their resources efficiently, so that we get the most economic growth. And these kinds of attitudes impede that. So underlying this is actually we have to confront what it means to have inclusive economic growth and what it means when our political candidates speak like this about a not an insignificant number of people in our economy.
Right. And your work certainly looks at the issues of inequality and intersectionality, and your work on the basic annual income in BC is very important. And your work is also very much, I think, informed by your work in Ottawa, your short time in Ottawa, on the thresholds and the eligibility criterion for getting into these social programs. And so one way of summarizing, I think, your work is that the devil is very much in the details of these social policy programs. Now, you were on Twitter, I think, today commenting on the cut that Premier Smith has announced on the income tax. that it will all actually benefit wealthier people more. Can you just unpack that a little bit for me?
Yeah. So the UCP have come out with what is an interesting proposal, right? It's a greater move away from the Alberta flat tax, which was a little surprising to see the UCP government come out with something like that. But at the same time, bringing in a lower rate for lower amounts of income fundamentally does help with progressivity in theory, and also addresses what we know about the heterogeneity with labor supply elasticity at both the intensive and extensive margin, because people are much more sensitive to tax rates down at the bottom than they are up at the top. But when you actually model these things, what you have to do is take into account the fact that people are complicated. The tax system is complicated, and there's going to be interaction effects. And there's also going to be differences according to how our distribution of income falls. And the distribution of income is not equal. Therefore, how a tax policy applies to people actually differs according to the factors that affect our distribution of income, the biggest one being gender. So more women, because of a variety of different factors, most of which are the result of, pathologies and power, women's income distribution is much lower, much at the lower end and less at the higher end. And as a result, because of the way that we've set our income thresholds for income tax, it means when we cut taxes, they don't benefit to the same degree that men do because their income is in the higher end. And that is where the bulk of the benefits accrue.
Right. Now, this is a good segue into the whole discussion around fiscal policy. So if you were to explain to somebody from Ontario Alberta's fiscal structure, how would you characterize it?
The biggest one I use is the roller coaster.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Because, there's some great gifts and people can understand, like when you're riding the roller coaster up, it's kind of fun. It's kind of neat. But when you're plummeting down, right. I mean, people throw up. People get disoriented. And so what Alberta has and has had under every conservative government and one NDP government is a fiscal plan that is wholly dependent on resource royalties, so that when the price of oil is high, everything is fine. And when the price of oil is low, it is a mess. Like, we can't balance our budget. We can't spend on programs, including healthcare. And so this ends up in this boom and bust cycle, which follows the public policy, the fiscal policy, right? So in bust, we cut, and in good times, we spend violently and freely. We are not Norway. We don't have a heritage fund. Every time we talk about setting a heritage fund up, it gets decimated because the price of oil is not in our control. And that continues after this election, regardless of who gets elected. So we are in a very precarious financial state in a province that both hates taxes but expects high social spending. So without resource royalties, you can't get to balance. And the only way to get out of this is to stop relying on resource royalties and, collecting more taxes or lowering our expectations for social services and public services.
Well, that's one of the things that I've characterized in my book on the sales tax. Just shameless.
Yes.
Called The Fiscal Dilemma. And I wanted to quote from Danielle Smith in this particular regard, because she wrote a paper for the School of Public Policy a few years ago, and she said this: "This is the fundamental conundrum of Alberta. We want gold-plated services, and we don't want to pay more taxes for them. Politicians are to blame for maintaining the fiction that this was sustainable. Anyone who proposes an alternative to raise taxes, the sales tax is the most obvious source of long-term revenue, the province could adopt to solve this structural shortfall. It is instantly shot down by politicians fearing that they won't be elected. And so we're in the midst of an election campaign. I don't believe the word sales tax have been uttered.
Nope.
I don't expect it to be uttered. I think there's a kind of a gentlewoman's agreement between leaders not to talk about it, because while in the book on the sales tax, I characterize it as not a panacea, but we have a political culture and political leaders that just simply do not want to speak about the unspeakable, this third rail of Alberta politics, and so how do we buttress ourselves? How does the province cushion there? The work I interviewed Todd Hirsch on his report to the NDP.
Mm-hmm.
And it's we're in the kind of gravy train stages where we do have some surplus dollars, although those are quickly evaporating, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, because WTI is down below promises. 70. Yep.
Yeah, and how do we ever turn that ship around? Because Albertans clearly do not want a degradation in their healthcare
Mm-hmm.
or their education system. Any thoughts on that?
Well, this election's not helping, right? I mean,
right.
What we are in fact seeing is, Danielle Smith is always interesting because you can't hold her to account that anything she said in the past, because apparently all that matters is what she does. And what she is doing is lowering taxes, increasing spending, and making us more reliant on resource royalties. The same can be said about the NDP, though the one package that they do have is increasing the corporate tax a marginal amount. It's not going to end up in what people are talking about in terms of losing investment and jobs. It's not like the crisis and the drama that's unfolding there, but at least there's some sense that we have to plug the gap. But it's not enough. You can't just plug this gap with diversification. Diversification takes generations, right? An economy doesn't change overnight. It takes a long, long time to diversify. So if you think about a structural industry base, that takes a long time to change. Do we talk about diversifying our revenues? Absolutely not. Is a sales tax a panacea? Of course not. Absolutely not. But we need more tools. And Alberta doesn't have very many tools that it hasn't already used in one way or another. So in the end, we need more taxes. Could be a sales tax. We could repatriate our carbon tax. Those are all there. We could talk about land transfer taxes and vacant home taxes, such as what's going on in other provinces. Again, there are costs and benefits to all of these different policies, but Albertans don't seem to want to change their preference for gold-plated public services.
Right. And one of the challenges and tensions really between Ottawa and Alberta, and I don't think that's going to change whether it's an orange or a blue stripe in power, is the question of climate change and federal commitments to lowering emissions, and the fact that the oil and gas industry are very large emitters across Canada, and that a pan-Canadian solution is likely to hurt Alberta much more than other provinces.
Well, we do need political certainty, though, when it comes to the carbon tax, because if there's anything that drives down investment and jobs more than anything else, it's political uncertainty. So, this argument that's going on, well, Alberta is on fire, has to be fundamentally addressed, because the answer is not to do nothing. That
Right.
cannot be the answer. And certainly any voter of any age must be able to understand that at this point in time. So it's not just a matter of battling it out. It's about understanding that we need to have a plan that businesses and people can rely on, so that they can make the right business decisions, so that we can reduce our emissions.
Right. Just a couple of comments. We'll put a slide up showing the fluctuation in resource revenues as a percentage of own source revenues over, say, 50 years. And as you know, it goes from 7 or 10% to 60 or 70% over that period. So it makes it very difficult for the Treasury folks to plan adequately. The other interesting tidbit, too, again, work that Kneebone has done, one of your colleagues, and Margarita Wilkins, is that really since 65, 66, Alberta, without non-renewable resource revenues, have never produced a surplus.
Never.
So the reason all that means is that we're paying 60 to 95% of the freight for our public services. And that is, I mean, to me, there's a sense of entitlement and also a sense of denial in just blithely carrying on as if that this is the normal state of things, and that, yes, this boom or bust will pass and we'll get on with the next sort of thing. An interesting discussion with Todd Hirsch. Todd is fairly optimistic about the Alberta economy. He talks about organic diversification. And I think that, and Lori Williams too was talking about, well, our energy industry is more than oil and gas, and that there's a lot of, path-making research at the universities and so on. But it seems to me that both the Liberal federal government and, I suspect the NDP, if they get into office, or the UCP, are all at Edom about carbon capture credits. So what's your opinion on that?
Sorry. It's such a controversial topic. And it's both values-based, it's subsidy-based, it's business-based, and it also is technology-based, all right? And so I think carbon capture and storage has a role to play. If anybody thinks it's a panacea, I think we've got big problems, right? It's a tool. And this is the thing with tackling, these climate issues, moving forward in renewables, which Alberta is leading in. I think a lot of people don't know that we've got a broad base of renewables, lots of projects starting up, and those projects are dependent on political stability and policy stability, like moving forward with carbon capture. So, in the end, while there can be, good arguments for or against, in the end, to actually make some strides, sometimes you have to go with a second or third best policy solution in order to be able to achieve some kind of forward progress. And I would put CCUS into that category of, it absolutely has to move forward, because it has to be that intermediary step that gets us there. And I don't think people back east understand that well enough.
Right. Now, it seems to me in the research I've done that the oil sands producers, and there's basically 4 that produce the lion's share of production, and contribute huge percentage of the royalties to the Crown right now, that they're not investing in their facilities. They're maintaining and the investment, which is roughly at the same level as the depreciation. So they're looking really for a handout from Ottawa and hoping to get some more maybe from Alberta to undertake this $16 billion or whatever in a capital investment. Those numbers, which sound large, are in fact quite small when you look at a 7 or 8 year time frame. In the 2014 period, the capital investment in energy was, I think, $50 billion. So we're in another phase, and perhaps part of it is that the Crown is harvesting through higher rents the amounts there. But I just the question of environmental liabilities is something that we've seen at the conventional level. We've seen the regulator really poo-poo the size of it, and we've seen the enforcement being somewhat lackadaisical.
Mm-hmm.
We've had now the Curl tailings ponds issue.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the cost of manufacturing and turning the bitumen into SO2 is much more expensive than what you could get out of the Saudi desert. So it just seems to me that from an economic efficiency point of view globally, it just doesn't make sense to be subsidizing a business that probably is not going to endure for much longer. I don't know. Am I missing something here?
Well, I mean, and this sort of gets at this whole corporate tax thing, okay, right? We've dropped our corporate taxes to be the lowest in the land, right? It's 8%. We also have accelerated depreciation at this point in time. All of these things are there, and it's supposed to, in some people's minds, spur all this investment so they don't need to be subsidized. Shockingly enough, businesses always want to be subsidized for doing things. I mean, look at what's going on with like electric batteries for electric vehicles, right? I mean,
yes.
as soon as you do one thing, all right, the house of cards starts coming down, and it's a race to the bottom. And that is why we have to think very carefully long term. And what is it that we want for 2030? What is it that we want for 2050? And when you start thinking about it in that way, then you start rethinking the targets of the subsidies, because we actually do have a plan. And we don't generally like to pick winners or losers, but when it comes to climate, there's not a lot of options here. We really need to stir and stimulate early on investment so that we can meet our targets, which are important to meet. So, and then the other thing we have going on in the oil patch is, of course, a number of projects that were worked on are coming online. So we should, dependent on WTI, still have a good source of royalties over the next 4 or 5 years. And now would certainly be a time to start thinking about those environmental liabilities that are out there, whether it be, orphan wells, or probably we're going to uncover much more environmental contamination like what we have seen recently. And so this is why we should have a fiscal base, so we can take those resource royalties, put them away, and use them to ensure that there's not intergenerational costs associated with activities that we approved. We seem to be able to do this when it comes to debt and deficit financing. Everybody what about the kids? We never say that when it comes to these environmental liabilities or what we should be doing with these resource royalties. And yet it is much more important in that area than it is in any other situation.
Right. Now, let's Lindsay, in terms of your views on investment and the Alberta job creation tax was put in place in 2019, and it was accelerated with COVID. Are you did you see any evidence of significant shifts in investment into the province over the last 4 years?
I mean, one way to look at it is that with the oil price collapse that happened in 2015, 2014, when the PCs were still in power, everybody likes to blame the NDP, but it started long before they got into power, right? And so when you look at that collapse, what happened is that the oil and gas industry took that as an opportunity to shed labor, invest in capital. And so it is actually not employing the kinds of people that it did before. And that is because it was already a laggard in capital investments over jobs. The other thing that we see with corporate tax cuts is the primary beneficiaries of them tend to be the top 10% of workers at firms and not the bottom 90%. So we have to think about the distributional impact of these things because it's important to think about these things because there's efficiency underlying all of those aspects.
Well, one of the comments you made earlier in the interview was very important, I think, and that's the question of values. And this is where we also get into the political conversation and what these two different visions are. And Alberta conservatives believe in both freedom and free enterprise and free markets and so on. And this particularly came to the forefront during the Klein Revolution. Mm-hmm. But it was consistent with what we were seeing in Western liberal democracies at the time. So thinking about the election and these two different visions, and thinking about the NDP, which is being criticized for or their weakness is on the economy and on fiscal matters. If you were a policy advisor to Notley, for example, what kinds of programs would you consider putting in, both for the collective good on the social welfare programs or the social programs, as well as being able to, improve the revenue base of the province, as well as to move our economic system from really a single commodity exporter to something that it has a little bit more diversity. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, I mean, I'll start off by just sort of talking about where you started from with values. And yes, the UCP and the NDP have very different ideologies and values. And you usually see that in election platforms. The 2019 UCP platform, I think, very much represented what you said in terms of the conservative ideology. We're not seeing that in this election. There is very little daylight between the policies that are being proposed by the UCP and the NDP. And that doesn't surprise me from the NDP side because the Alberta NDP have always been quite centrist. But the UCP have moved so far central that they have a lot of socialism in their election platform. I don't have a problem with it, but it doesn't match their ideology. And it doesn't match when you have candidates like Casey Madhu coming out saying, we are the free enterprise, capitalist, free market party, when their policies don't match that. Right. So, if I were advising, and we see this in both the UCP and the NDP, an accelerated plan to move forward on $10 a day early learning and education and childcare, right? We want to accelerate that. We want to get more spots. We want to be training more people. That is, in fact, a major area of economic growth by ensuring that we have, a high quality future workforce. This issue of the revenue seems to be an election killer, right? So you do want to diversify your revenues, But it would, in this province right now, it would be an election killer to come forward with repatriating the carbon tax, sales tax, or things like that. So while it makes sense, it, on an economic standpoint, doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense on the political standpoint. So how do you then move the needle in your 4 years to be able to start to we, and I shouldn't say start having these conversations, because we've had them. We have them over and over and over again, and we just can't come to grips with it. But one might also say that if the NDP win an election, it might only be one term. So why not go for gusto?
Right. Yeah.
But that's political calculus I can't do. But I would like to see, there's one area, there's a multitude of different areas, but a big one here in Alberta still is how much the Alberta government relies on property taxes to fund education. And it should get out of that space. And that would immediately result in the reduction of property taxes across all of Alberta, and ensure that education is funded in the way that it needs to be, which is not locally, right? Because it's not a local public good. It has broad externalities. It shouldn't matter where you live. You should have high quality education regardless. And so I think that that's a big one that's been missing from the conversation, is getting out of that tax space. But the provincial government loves it, because it's the municipalities who get the hit for a provincial tax. I mean, it's brilliant from a political standpoint. It's bad tax policy.
That's right. That's right. Speaking of early education, maybe just outline the social benefits that arise from that type of subsidy to working families.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's not just social benefits, right? I mean, the early learning childcare system is a market failure, right? It's a thin market. We don't have enough spots. We don't have the right spots in the right areas and neighborhood. Economists too often sort of say, oh, well, there's 40 some odd % spots for all of the kids between 0 and 5. It doesn't help me if the only spot I can get is 30 kilometers to the north of where I work. Right. I mean, it's just it is not a feasible and functional system based off of, geolocation. So we have to take into account geolocation. The social benefits come from considering geolocation, quality, right? And this is the part we seem to understand educational quality in K through 12 and post-secondary, but everybody thinks that early learning education is babysitting, and it is not. Anybody who's had a kid in, and I have, knows how important that quality is, so that they are ready to go through the K through 12 system. Alberta is also quite different than many other provinces in that we still only have, what we call half-day kindergarten, right? We have provinces that already have JK all the way up. So they cover 3-year-olds all the way up. We're still here. They call it half-day, but it's 2 hours and 25 minutes of kindergarten a day. It was the most stressful year as a parent, was the kindergarten year here in Alberta, because it was impossible to cobble together the kinds of care that you needed to both get them to school, get them to their aftercare provider, get them home, all of those sorts of things. But the quality is, this is why we talk about early learning education, is because it is about accessible, affordable, high quality. And there is curriculum, right? I mean, here in Alberta, we have the flight program. There is curriculum in all of these places. And we want our kids to be safe. And the benefits come from having acquired, I know people hate it when I use this word, but I'm an economist, human capital, right? Human capital is acquired from the get-go, even in utero, right? The whole development of a child and the brain and its social functions, all of this is all dependent on us. We used to say it takes a village. Now, apparently, all it takes is, like, we're all on our own. I fundamentally don't agree with that when we're actually talking about our entire labor pool that leads to a capital pool, that leads to economic growth, that leads to those high quality jobs. You can't just say all that matters is post-secondary. You have to care from day one all the way along. And so you can't separate all of these things from each other, which seems to be what a lot of people more on the right want to do. It's just babysitting. It's not worth my time. Pay for your own kids, as though there isn't the social benefit that comes from it.
Right. And your work, you talk quite a lot about the care economy and the centrality of that economy, not only in terms of its social significance, but in terms of its impact on the economy itself.
Yeah. And the care economy is cradle to grave, as we should have learned in COVID, right? I think a lot of people forget how much caregiving also goes. I'm in part of the sandwich generation right now. And so, caregiving is a life cycle issue that predominantly falls on women. And when we don't have the right structures and systems in place, this leads to inefficient economic decisions.
Now, let's cast ourselves to the 29th and the 30th of May. And perhaps two scenarios I'd like you to maybe think about, and it's a bit of a thought experiment. And that is, in one scenario, Daniel Smith wins. The other scenario, too, Rachel Notley wins. So what would you, what's your sense of, under a Smith government, with a, let's assume, a comfortable majority, what policy measures would she undertake? How would the relationship with Ottawa unfold? Those kinds of major policy issues.
Yeah, and so I'll grant you a third possible outcome, which was what happened in BC in 2017, where we didn't know the outcome of the election for 4 months. So
right.
there is an alternative, and
yes.
The polling is all over the place right now. So I have no insight into this, and it changes regularly. I think the big question mark with Danielle Smith and the UCP is that while they have a fairly progressive electoral platform, their seats that they're going to win are mostly going to be rural Albertan seats, right? And this is where we're seeing a lot of the interesting takes on things going on in society. So I think that actually it matters a lot as to who actually ends up being part of her caucus, as to whether or not I have no faith that their election platform is what they will proceed on, because of how, if they win, they won't have that many progressives in. Right. They're going to lose a lot of the PCs. Right, which yes. I'm a red Tory, right? So I mean, if they're going to lose those, you end up with a very different makeup of a caucus than who's informing her now. And so, what we still don't know about, right, is things like the Alberta Pension Plan, the Sovereignty Act, how they're going to proceed with, everybody forgets Alberta does actually have a carbon tax. It's set to increase. Is that going to keep going on? How are these views of the controversial candidates going to affect how policy is rolled out? So I have a lot of questions, and it's really dependent on what her caucus looks like. I just think it's going to be much more political uncertainty and turmoil than would exist otherwise. With Jason Kenney, you got what you got. We can all, have our views about that. He had a platform. It got put into place. He followed it. There really weren't any surprises. Here, I don't have that confidence.
Yeah, the surprise was really COVID, which was
Oh yeah, but
a black
that
swan event. Yes,
it's
yes.
like oil prices collapsing in 2014. That's not Rachel Notley's fault either.
No, 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 that's true. So what about a Notley government?
There, I think you have a lot of predictability. I just don't see, because they're going to win Edmonton, because they always win Edmonton. I think they're going to pick up some spots here in Calgary. I'm in an NDP riding. I'm in Calgary Mountain View, which is already held by Kathleen Ganley. But certainly looking around, it looks like Varsity is a very, very close race. Glenmore's very, very close. Like right there's a lot of really close races here. But I'm less concerned about who gets in as to what their caucus will look like and how that will influence the implementation of their election platform. So like one of the big ones they're going to move forward with very quickly is by January 1st, 2024, we will have the full allotment of the $10 a day early learning and education childcare. I also know that because they have somebody like Raki in their caucus, she'll be a minister, and she will ensure high quality. She knows that flight program curriculum. She's got kids in early childhood education as well as in K through 12. So I have a lot of confidence that that's going to move forward because she's very knowledgeable on the system. I think they'll move forward on a lot of those healthcare expenditures. As a public finance economist, though, I worry about how much we are investing in healthcare infrastructure over operating, because infrastructure then comes with future operating costs. And while I appreciate everybody wants a hospital within, a certain distance, it's very, very expensive. And you can look to BC. I lived in BC for 11 years. I lived on the island. The only children's hospital we had was in Vancouver. And so it's like a whole trip. If you've ever tried to leave the island, it's not, you don't just leave the island, right? It's a big planning production and things like that. But there really weren't calls to build a children's hospital on the island because it didn't make sense from a cost benefit perspective. So I do have some concerns there on how they're going to move forward with some of that operating, and given that they're still relying on resource royalties, how much of that operating is put at risk by putting that kind of pressure onto the system.
Right. And it's interesting because David Dodge did work with Notley's government early on and recommended a big deficit. There was supposedly an infrastructure deficit, and that could be addressed. And part of the reason was interest rates were so low, so it was almost inexcusable to borrow money to fund these kinds of projects, which do produce short-term construction jobs. But as you point out, it's a long-term operating expense, and many of the rural hospitals are not really fully utilized in this way. I can remember the former Deputy Treasurer Al O'Brien commenting on this, that yeah, fine, let's build them, but it's just going to, it's a negative annuity. It's not a negative annuity. It just costs so much.
Well, haven't we blown up hospitals in the past? Didn't Ralph Klein? Yeah. So talk about a make work project.
Right. But it just, these promises do concern economists and people like myself who have worked in the department and have borrowed great gobs of money when oil prices were low, and to the extent to which the facility to borrow money in New York or London or whatever allows politicians to kick the can down the hall, down the road. But certainly the last year, we've seen that incredible turnaround from a projected $18 billion deficit, I think, to a $4 billion surplus. It's just inconceivable. No other provincial government in this country has ever experienced that sort of thing.
That's very correct. Yeah.
And it does, I mean, it does make it very difficult for politicians to budget appropriately, and the civil servants that work for them to create, and in the past they've created rules to say, okay, no more than 3 billion will go into the general revenue and the rest will go into the heritage fund and all that. But, you know, once the pressures built and oil prices and gas prices were high, then that was all. So absent a constitutional, some kind of amendment to the Alberta Act, which Ted Norton's talked about, which would force governments to run balanced budgets, which is an American kind of invention. I really don't, it just seems to me that politics is increasingly dysfunctional, and that much of the policy that's been announced by the Smith government since she took office has been a rather scattergun approach.
Yeah.
$1 million here, 10 million for this road there. And perhaps it was motivated with input from the MLA saying, I'm worried about whether I'm going to be reelected and we need some money here, or there's been this long standing promise to different interest groups. And yeah, we've got an extra few $1 billion, so we'll do it. And I think the most, in my opinion, scandalous announcement was with the Calgary Arena.
Oh.
So you're a Calgarian. How is that playing in the conversations with your neighbors?
Not well. Right. And especially as you see communities in the United States going to plebiscites and rejecting taxpayer subsidies for these billionaires who own these teams. Right. I mean, there's just not a lot of benefits that come from this. And I think what everybody sort of forgets is, okay, so we build, and, you know, people get their knickers in a knot when I say we're going to build an arena. It's an event center. Okay, fine. It's an event center. But all this is going to do is there's going to be some marginal increase in activities here in Calgary, but it's going to move them from some spaces in Calgary to another, right? So we're just kind of, you know, eating our own. And it's also going to move some things from like Red Deer or Lethbridge down to here. So from a provincial perspective, it doesn't make much sense. I mean, the announcement was clearly politically tied. It was done, was it the day or 2 days before the writ? It seems like it was like a year ago that the writ was tabled. So, you know, it was clearly done. And most people here that I talk to always wonder, how much did Murray Edwards force the timing of that, since he is a staunch conservative supporter and what have you. But no, it's not playing well. It's not playing well at all. And I think that Rachel Notley's approach is actually a smart approach, because we here in Calgary are extremely concerned, not only about the overall cost, because there's a huge opportunity cost to what Calgary's putting in, but the cost overruns, which look like they all fall on us, the Calgary taxpayers, and we know nothing, right? What was released was a one-page document with a bunch of bullets. We don't have any of the details. It's highly problematic. And I think Danielle Smith got that message quite early on, because within, 2 days, she says, oh, well, it's not an election issue. Let's not talk about it. And that it seems to have finally filtered its way in through the system, because it wasn't going to win them the votes that they thought it was, because they completely misread Calgary.
Right. One final theme that I wanted to touch on and get your views on is this tendency for populations, and I'm thinking of Brexit in particular, and also the election of Trump, the distrust of elites. Mm-hmm. And the distrust of the city in London, the distrust of elites on both West and East Coasts in the United States and the intelligentsia and so on. There are a lot of policy areas that people like you and me can agree with, such as a sales tax, but that corporate handouts are not really a very good thing for the population as a whole and tend to increase inequality. What is your take? And maybe does any of this? I don't get the sense in looking at the UCP literature that they're attacking academics and intellectuals, but in the conversations I've had with Laurie Williams, there is some fear about retribution, either on social media or how comfortable they feel expressing themselves freely.
So I can say, since Daniel Smith has come in, that the retribution, the what are they called? The issues managers. We always called them the Matts, because they were led by Matt, and they called him Laundry Matt. I mean, it was just hilarious, right? It was all these Matts out there under Jason Kenney. It was shocking. Like the amount that you would get attacked, the phone calls, the innuendo, the things that would happen. And this happened to me. So, Charles Rusnell recently put out a piece in the Tyee. That's all very true under Jason Kenney, without a shadow of a doubt. That was mean politics, without question. And I know friends who lost their jobs because of mundane things that they said on Twitter. And you can also look at what happened to the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce before Yedlin came in. She was also relieved, and it was well articulated through the whole system that this was a call from the UCP. So they feel quite free, actually, not necessarily the politicians, but the issues managers, the staffers, and the donors of trying to get you to shut up. But if your policies are so great and fantastic, why do you need to get us to shut up? But under Smith, the mood has changed. Whether or not that will stay in place past the if they get into power, will they go back to their wicked ways? I don't know, but yes, I've never seen anything like this. And, I've been active in many provinces, and I've never experienced the kinds of retributions that I have here. And I would say, for shame on, the University of Calgary, who has not handled these issues very well at all.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, again for spending time with me. And I think that the next 10 days will be very interesting. Tonight, of course, is the leaders' debate.
Yes.
And we'll see how Ms. Notley and Ms. Smith do. So again, Lindsay, thank you very much for the time.
No, thank you very much for having me.
Okay.